Have you ever been faced with a choice that could change not just your life, but someone else's forever? One quiet evening on the edge of the New Mexico desert, a widowed woman stepped outside to find an Apache warrior standing in the fading light, a half-starved baby in his arms, his voice trembling with one desperate request: milk. She knew the danger, the whispers in town, the old fears between her people and his. Helping him could cost her safety, maybe even her life. Yet in that moment, there was only one question in her heart. If I turn away, what happens to this child? Imagine it, the weight of that decision in your hands, the small heartbeat against your chest, the eyes of a man who has lost everything watching you. Would you walk away or step into a story that could never be undone? Come with me into the wild, open country where fear and hope collide, and discover what happens when compassion takes root in the hardest ground. If this story touches your heart, please like, share, and subscribe, and let's begin. The heat clung to the bones that day in Copper Ridge. The sun, white and merciless, had burned the clouds away hours ago, leaving nothing but a sky so bright it made a person squint until their temples ached. The wind carried grit and the faint scent of sagebrush, dry and brittle from too many months without rain. Clara May sat alone on the bench outside the old railway depot, its paint faded to the color of old parchment. The trains hadn't stopped here in nearly 5 years, not since the silver mines had closed and the town began to shrink like a creek in August. Still, she came sometimes, because it was the only place where the world felt far enough away to let her breathe. In her lap lay a small blanket, once white, now worn soft with use. She held it the way a woman might hold a baby, though there was no child in her arms. Her own boy had been buried 6 weeks ago, fever stealing him in the night while the doctor's horse was still 3 miles down the road. She had not yet learned how to let her hands be empty. That was when she saw him. He came from the east, walking out of the heat shimmer, a tall man wrapped in a sun-bleached deerskin shirt, the fringe hanging still in the windless air. His black hair, tied at the nape, was matted with dust. Across his chest he cradled a bundle of cloth, and from within came the thin, desperate cry of a newborn. When he was close enough, Clara saw his face sharp-boned, the lines of hunger and fatigue carved deep around his mouth. His skin was the copper brown of the desert itself. She knew, without doubt, that he was Apache. He stopped a few feet from her and, to her astonishment, dropped to his knees on the splintered depot boards. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse, every breath like sand in his throat. "He needs milk, or he won't make it through the night." The baby's cry broke into a choking gasp, then started again, weaker this time. Clara's own body ached at the sound. She had thought the milk would dry up once her boy was gone, but it hadn't not yet. She looked from the man's face to the child in his arms. The baby's skin was flushed and hot, his tiny fists clenching the air. "I can't," she began, but the words caught in her throat. She wasn't sure if it was because she feared what her neighbors would say, a white woman nursing an Apache child, or because she feared what it might do to her own heart. The man's eyes didn't waver. "My name is Jonah Koa. His mother is gone. There's no other way." Clara knew enough of Apache ways to understand the danger in what he was asking. She had heard whispers that their people believed a child's soul could be weakened, even lost, if nursed by a woman from another bloodline. If the elders learned of it, both man and child might face punishment. Jonah seemed to read her hesitation. "If the tribe finds out, it will be my death. Maybe his too." But without milk, he let the sentence die there, unfinished, as if the end didn't need speaking. The wind shifted then, carrying the faint scent of dust and horses from the south. Somewhere out there, far beyond the depot, the world was still moving, wagons creaking, cattle lowing, lives carrying on as if nothing had changed. But here, in this quiet, only the three of them existed. Clara's arms tightened around the empty blanket in her lap. She thought of her boy's last breath, the way his small body had gone still in her arms. She thought of the nights since, when her body had woken her, aching with milk that had nowhere to go. Her gaze dropped to the baby again, the way his mouth opened wide between sobs, the way his eyes, dark as wet stone, seemed to search the air for something he could not name. She let the blanket slide from her lap. "All right," she said softly. "Give him to me." Jonah's hands trembled as he passed the child over. Clara settled him against her, and he rooted instinctively, his cry breaking into frantic whimpers. When he latched, the sound of his swallowing was the only thing in the air. Jonah lowered his head, not looking at her. "Thank you," he murmured, and there was something raw in the way he said it, as if gratitude were not a language he often spoke. For a long time, they stayed that way, Clara in the shade of the depot roof, Jonah kneeling beside her, the baby's tiny breaths warm against her skin. She didn't know what would happen when the milk was gone, or what storms might come if word reached his people. But for now, this was all there was. A man's plea, a woman's answer, and a child who had found, if only for the moment, what he needed most. They left Copper Ridge under the kind of moonlight that made the desert look like a sheet of silver. Clara May had packed quickly, not much, just a loaf of bread wrapped in oilcloth, a small tin of coffee, and the baby swaddling, still warm from where he had slept against her. Jonah Koa had nothing more than the shirt on his back, a worn wool blanket, and a skin of water. The depot was far behind them now, just a smudge against the pale horizon. The only sounds were the steady clop of the bay mare Jonah had borrowed from a livery on the edge of town, and the occasional sigh of the baby in Clara's arms. Jonah walked beside the mare, his hand on the reins. Clara rode, holding the child close, the cool night air brushing her cheeks. She could feel the steady thump of the baby's heartbeat against her own. "Where are we going?" she asked after a long while. "Away," Jonah said simply. She waited for more, but his voice carried no room for questions. The land rolled out before them in low swells, dotted with yucca and mesquite. Once in a while, a jackrabbit bolted from the shadows, its long legs flashing pale in the moonlight. They stopped once to let the mare drink from a shallow creek. Clara took a sip of water, then dipped a corner of the blanket into the creek and pressed it to the baby lips. At dawn, they found a narrow wash between two low ridges and stopped to rest. Jonah spread the wool blanket on the sand. Clara sat cross-legged, nursing the baby while Jonah tended the mare. When he came back, she saw him watching her with a look she couldn't quite name. Not suspicion exactly, not trust either. Something in between. "What's his name?" she asked. Jonah hesitated, then said, "Nayati." He rolled the word softly, the vowels long, the consonants like the tap of stones. "It's beautiful," Clara said. "What does it mean?" "Stands firm," Jonah replied. His gaze drifted to the far horizon. "He will need to, after the baby had fed." Clara wrapped him snug and laid him beside her. Jonah sat across from her, legs folded, his hands resting on his knees. "You said his mother is gone," Clara began. Jonah's eyes didn't leave the horizon. "2 moons ago, soldiers came before dawn, looking for our men. They set fire to the lodges. She—" His voice faltered. "She did not wake." The silence between them was thick. Clara thought of her own nights without sleep, sitting at her boy's bedside, begging a God who seemed too far to hear. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. Jonah nodded once. "I buried her by the river. Then I ran, but he was already hungry." His gaze flicked to the baby. "I thought I could find a goat, or another mother. I found you instead." Clara gave a small, tired smile. "I'm not sure what that makes me." "A choice," Jonah said. "One you did not have to make." The day grew hotter, the sun like a weight pressing on their backs. They moved on, the mare's hooves kicking up dust. Jonah showed her how to wrap a strip of cloth around her head to keep the sun from burning her neck. He pointed out where the cactus fruit grew sweet and red in the heat, where the mesquite pods could be chewed for their sweetness. That night, they camped near a trickle of water that fed into a small pool. Clara washed the baby cloths and spread them on warm rocks to dry. Jonah sat a little apart, mending the mare's saddle strap with a length of rawhide. When the wind shifted, Clara caught the scent of smoke faint. But there, she saw Jonah's head lift, his body going still. "Someone's close," he said. Clara's hands tightened around the baby. "Your people." "Maybe," Jonah said. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made her stomach knot. They banked the fire low and sat in silence until the stars wheeled overhead. The baby stirred and whimpered, and Clara pressed her lips to his hair, whispering nonsense words to soothe him. Jonah watched, his face unreadable. In the days that followed, the rhythm of their journey began to settle. Clara would nurse the baby at dawn and dusk. Jonah would gather what little food the land offered, and they would walk until the mare's shadow grew long. They spoke little, but when they did, it was often in small, practical exchanges. How far to the next water? Which path through the rocks was safest? One evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, Clara noticed Jonah lingering by the baby's side, his fingers brushing the child's cheek. There was a tenderness in the gesture that surprised her, given the steel she had seen in him. She realized then that trust was growing between them, slow as water seeping into dry ground, but steady. And though she still didn't know where the road was taking them, she began to feel, for the first time since her boy's death, that maybe there was something ahead worth reaching for. By the third night, the desert felt closer, as if the land itself had leaned in to listen. The wind that had been still now came in short gusts, lifting grit from the brown flats and laying it back down like a veil. Somewhere behind them lay Copper Ridge, a shrinking dot on the edge of memory. Ahead was more of the same swells of earth, dry washes, brush low as a person's knee, and a sky with no kindness in it. They moved before dawn. Clara May rode the bay mare with Nayati tucked to her breast, the blanket snug under her chin. Jonah Koa walked on her left, a steady figure with his palm on the rein and his eyes always working. Every so often he would stop, press his hand against the ground, and read what the dirt cared to say. Then he would nod, and they would go on. By mid-morning the heat climbed past 90 degrees. The light turned hard. They kept to the shadow of a low ridge, following a faint animal track that wove in and out of creosote. A hawk circled above them, a dark coin against the pale sky. Jonah held up his hand. Clara felt the mare slow underneath her. "What is it?" she asked. He pointed with his chin. On the open gravel to their right, a line of prints showed fresh. Not deer, not coyote, horses. 4 of them. The edges were sharp, not yet softened by wind. How far? Clara whispered. "Half a day," Jonah said. "Maybe less if they are riding hard." She thought of the way sound carried on open ground. how a single hoofbeat could seem near when it was still miles off. She drew Nayati closer and felt his warm weight settle. "We need the arroyo," Jonah said. "Sand will take our tracks quicker." They slid down a crumbly bank into a dry wash. The sand there was cool underfoot, shaded by a lip of clay. Cottonwood roots reached down like fingers. After a mile, the wash narrowed to a throat and the ground turned to stone. Jonah let out a slow breath. Half relief. "Good," he said. "Rock does remember." Before noon, the sky changed without warning. A low line of haze built along the southern horizon, brown at the base and the color of pewter above. Jonah shaded his eyes with his hand. "Sand," he said. "Big one." "How long?" Clara asked. "An hour. Maybe less." They pushed for higher ground and found a shallow cave in the face of the ridge, no deeper than 15 feet, but out of the wind. Jonah led the mare to the lee side and looped the rein over a jut of rock. Clara slid down and hurried inside with the baby, bracing her back to the stone. The air was 10 degrees cooler there, and it smelled faintly of wet dust, the kind that lives inside rock. The sandstorm reached them like a wall. Wind roared through the wash at more than 40 miles an hour, carrying grit that stung skin and filled the mouth with the taste of iron. The mare set her legs wide and lowered her head. The world outside turned to a single sound, a long, unbroken note that swallowed everything else. Clara bent her body over Nayati and felt him cry against her chest. She whispered into his hair, small words without meaning. It did not matter what they were, only the rhythm mattered. She hummed until her throat ached, and then hummed some more. Jonah crouched near the mouth of the cave, face turned sideways to keep the sand from his eyes. He studied the direction the gust curled into the stone, and then used his hands to pile a small berm across the opening, just enough to blunt the blow. His fingers were quick and sure. When he finished, he came back to them and sat with his back to the wall, close enough to be a shield if the wind changed. "Storm will wipe the ground clean," he said over the noise. "Tracks gone? For a day. Maybe 2. That helps us," Clara said. "It helps and hurts." He said, 4 horses will know to look for caves." Clara ran her palm along Nayati's back, feeling the small bones under her hand. She had learned the shape of this child in just a few days, the way a person learns a new road by walking it. His weight, his breathing, the heat of his skin at the crown of his head. When the worst of the sand had passed and the wind settled into fitful gusts, she unwrapped the blanket to check him. Grit dusted the cloth like flour. She shook it gently, then wiped the child's cheeks with the edge of her skirt. That was when she felt it, a hard circle beneath the swaddling where his collarbone should be smooth. "What's this?" she asked softly. Jonah looked up, alert. Clara eased the blanket open another inch. A small pendant lay against the child's skin, silver gone dull with use, hung on a leather thong. The surface was stamped with a design she did not know, a radiating sun over a line of mountains, and below that, what might have been a bird or a wind symbol. Jonah reached as if to touch it and then stopped, his fingers hovering. For the first time since she had met him, something like fear crossed his face. "You know it," Clara said. He nodded once. "What does it mean?" Jonah took the thong gently and lifted it enough to see. His voice, when it came, was flatter than before. "It is the sign of Ironcloud," he said. "Nakai Ironcloud, our headman." Clara waited. "Nayati's mother," Jonah said, the words careful, "was his daughter." The cave felt smaller all at once. The air seemed to go out of it and leave only the sound of Clara's own blood in her ears. "Your boy is the headman's grandson," she said. "He is," Jonah answered, His eyes had gone far away, and I have taken him to the breast of a white woman. The truth of it lay between them, simple and heavy. What will they do if they find us? Clara asked, though she already knew. They will take him, Jonah said. They will call him lost to his blood. They will say he must return to the earth so his spirit can be made whole. Clara drew Nayati closer, as if she could fold him into her body. For a moment, heat rose in her chest, sharp as anger. "And you," she said quietly, "what will they do to you?" Jonah's mouth tightened. "A man who breaks the old ways is not a man in the circle," he said. "But it is not my death I fear." Clara watched him and struggled with a thought she did not want. Was she a shelter or a bargaining chip if it came to it? Would Jonah hand her over to buy mercy for his son, or had he already given up his place for the sake of this child? And she was no more than a witness to that loss. Jonah seemed to hear the question. She did not speak. He shifted, drew closer by a hand's width, and kept his gaze on the cave mouth. "I brought him here because there was no milk," he said. "I keep him with you now for the same reason a person keeps fire in winter. It is not a trick. There is nothing to trade." Clara nodded. Once. It was enough, or it would have to be. The storm broke toward late afternoon. The wind died to a whisper, and the world beyond the cave turned soft again, as if the land were apologizing for its temper. Dust hung in the air like smoke. The ridge above them wore a pale coat of grit. Jonah went to the opening and studied the wash below. Where their tracks had been, there was only a smooth skin of sand, new as unmarked paper. He came back and spoke low. "We move at dusk. The air will be cooler. They will be walking their horses by then." "Will they find this place?" Clara asked. "If they are good," he said, "and they are good." They left when the shadows ran long and blue. Jonah led the mare along the high side of the wash where the wind had scoured the ground clean. Clara rode without speaking, the baby dozing lightly against her. The air was cooler by 10 degrees, and the smell after the storm was like wet clay and crushed sage. They made 3 miles before they heard it, the faint rhythmic thud that a person feels in the ribs before the ear believes it is sound. Hooves, distant, but not a trick of the land. Jonah lifted his hand. The mare stopped. Clara felt the hair rise on her arms. The thudding grew a little louder, then held steady. "They are not in the wash," he said. "They are on the ridge road. We will keep to the shadow. Slow." They moved again, a careful line inside the deeper blue where night had already taken hold. Twice Jonah stopped to listen. Twice the hoofbeats thinned and thickened, as if the riders were fanning out and then drawing together. Once, for a long minute, the sound vanished altogether, and they stood without breathing, 3 figures inside a world that had stopped. When they reached a split in the wash, Jonah turned up the narrower branch, where a spill of rock made a short climb. At the top, in a shallow pocket of stone, he found a place where a small fire had been built not 2 days past. The ash was fine, gray, and unbroken. He touched it with the back of his fingers and drew away. "Cold," he said, "old enough to be nothing. But we are not the only ones who know this ridge." Clara looked out across the flats. The moon had not yet risen. The first stars were just beginning to show, shy as new foals. "How long can we keep ahead?" she asked. "As long as he needs us to," Jonah said, and he glanced at Nayati with a look that steadied her in a way nothing else could. They pushed on another mile and found a shelf of rock that faced north, out of sight from the ridge road. There they made their bed on the warm stone. Jonah uncinched the saddle and let the mare crop what sparse grass she could find. Clara laid the child between them, one hand on his belly to feel the small lift and fall. When the night settled deep, the land grew quiet. A whip poor Will called once and was silent. Far off, something metal struck rock, a single note, then nothing. Clara could not sleep. She watched the dim outline of Jonah's shoulder against the sky and felt the old ache rise and fade, the way a person feels weather in a bone that was once broken. "Jonah," she said, her voice barely above a breath. He answered with a small sound to show he was awake. "If they come tomorrow," she said, "I will not let them take him without being seen." Jonah did not turn his head. "I know," he said. After a beat, he added, "and I will not let them take you." The words surprised her more than she let show. She lay with them for a long time, like a small stone held warm in the hand. Outside, the wind changed, just a little, and somewhere in the dark a pebble clicked and came to rest. At first light, the storm skin lay smooth over the wash. Their tracks had been erased, as Jonah had promised. For a day, the land belonged to them. They saddled the mare and started north, the air cool and clean, the desert smelling new. By mid-morning they would reach a shallow lake Jonah knew, a place where birds gathered and the world for an hour remembered kindness. But storms end, and hoofbeats, once heard, are not forgotten. The lake Jonah spoke of was not much more than a shallow bowl in the earth, fed by a spring that ran underground for most of the year. In the dry months, the water was the color of hammered pewter, rimmed with reeds that whispered even when the air was still. Birds came in low arched grebes, coots, and a heron with wings like stretched canvas, landing with soft splashes that seemed louder than they were. They reached it just after mid-morning. Clara slid from the mare and felt her knees protest after the long ride. She carried Nayati down to the water's edge, where the dampness in the air softened the grit that clung to her skin. The baby stirred, yawned without opening his eyes, and settled again against her shoulder. Jonah unsaddled the mare and let her drink, her sides working from the miles behind them. He crouched beside the water and dipped his hands, letting it run through his fingers before drinking. When he looked up, there was a question in his eyes. "Can we stay a while?" Clara asked. He nodded. "An hour, maybe 2. We must move before the sun tips west." She knelt and soaked a strip of cloth, then wiped the baby's face and neck. The coolness made him sigh. She did the same for herself, closing her eyes against the relief. When she opened them, Jonah was watching her, not in the way a man watches a woman, but in the way a scout watches the sky, measuring what it might hold. "You've carried him like he was yours since the first night," Jonah said, his voice low. Why Clara let the question sit? She could have said a dozen things that no one else would, that it was the decent thing, that she owed him nothing and everything all at once. Instead, she looked down at Nayati's small hand resting against her chest. "Because someone once carried me," she said, "and if they hadn't, I wouldn't be here." Jonah's gaze did not waver. "Who, my mother's sister?" Clara said. "After my folks died, she was a hard woman, but she kept me fed. Sometimes. That's all it is, feed them and keep them warm until they can walk on their own." Jonah was quiet for a long moment. Then, with a small movement, he reached into the pouch at his belt and pulled out a strip of soft leather. Tied in, it was a feather gray with a black tip worn smooth by time. He held it out. "This is from the first bird I ever caught with my own hands," he said. I kept it because my mother told me it was a sign of patience. If you would keep it with him, it will remind him where he comes from." Clara took it carefully. The leather was warm from his body heat. She tucked it into the folds of the blanket around Nayati, where it lay like a secret. They rested in the shade of a bent cottonwood. Clara fed the baby while Jonah walked the edge of the water, scanning the ground. Once he bent and picked up something, a horseshoe nail, bent almost flat. He turned it over in his hand, then let it fall back into the mud. "Riders?" Clara asked when he returned. He nodded, but not from today. Maybe 2, 3 days passed. Could be anyone. The air around the lake felt easy, almost safe, but under it ran the same taut thread that had pulled them from Copper Ridge. They spoke little. Silence had grown between them, not from distance, but from the kind of knowing that makes words unnecessary. By midday they were riding again, the sun high and white. The land shifted subtly, the washes deeper, the ridges sharper, a smell of resin from scattered pinyon pines. Jonah set their path northeast, toward hills where water might be found again. The afternoon heat pressed down hard. Clara's shirt stuck to her back, and the mare's breathing grew heavier. Jonah stopped in a pocket of shade where a stand of mesquite huddled together. Their branches tangled like old men in conversation. He took the canteen and handed it to her first. "Drink slow," he said. "We'll have more in 2 hours." While she sipped, Jonah stood listening. It was the kind of listening that seemed to pull his whole frame into stillness. Clara thought she heard it too, a faint, irregular clink, like metal against stone, carried on the wind. Not hoofbeats this time. Something else. "What is it?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not sure. Could be a pick or a shovel. Could be wind and rock. But sound doesn't carry this far unless it means to." The thought settled in her like grit in a wound. She shifted Nayati to the other arm and tightened the blanket around him. They moved on. Twice more the sound came, faint and then gone. It made Clara think of someone tracking them, not by sight, but by feel-keeping just far enough back to stay out of reach. By late afternoon, the land opened into a long valley. A creek cut through its center, narrow but bright against the earth. Jonah led them down to the bank, where willows grew in thin rows. He bent to drink, then froze, his hand in the water. "What is it?" Clara whispered. He pointed. On the opposite bank, in the soft mud, was a single print. Human. Barefoot. The toes were long, the heel narrow, the arch deep, the kind of print that belongs to someone used to walking without shoes. Clara felt the hair lift on the back of her neck. "Apache?" she asked. Jonah's jaw tightened. "Yes, but not from my band. Too small. Could be a scout." He studied it a moment longer, then stood. "We'll camp in the open tonight. No cover means no shadows for someone to hide in." That night, they built a small fire with no more flame than a lantern wick, just enough to warm the baby's milk. The stars were clear, scattered so wide it felt like falling to look at them. Clara sat with Nayati in her lap, Jonah across from her, between them. The silence stretched again, but now it carried something heavier. "Do you think they know where we're going?" she asked. Jonah's eyes stayed on the dark beyond the fire. "If they don't yet, they will soon." The flames flickered against his face, throwing lines of shadow that made him look older than he had that morning. Clara thought about the pendant under Nayati's blanket, about the feather now tucked there too. Symbols of where he had come from and what might be trying to take him back. For a long time, none of them moved. Then Jonah spoke, so quietly she had to lean forward to hear. "If it comes to it," he said. "You take the child and ride east. Don't look back." Clara met his gaze. "If it comes to it," she said. "We both ride." Something in his expression softened, and for the first time since Copper Ridge, she thought she saw the man he might have been before the hunt began, not just a warrior, but a father who wanted more than survival. The fire burned low. The desert cooled fast, the heat bleeding away until the air was thin and sharp. Clara drew the blanket higher over Nayate's head and listened to the night. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, and beneath it, so faint she almost doubted it, came the slow, measured sound of someone walking through sand. The sound came again before dawn, faint, deliberate, like someone setting each foot down with care. Clara felt it before she truly heard it, the way a deer knows the presence of a hunter by the weight of the air. She reached for Nayate and found him warm against her, still asleep. Jonah was already standing, his head turned toward the east, one hand resting on the hilt of his knife. The first light was spilling over the ridge, painting the sand in thin strokes of gold. Jonah motioned for silence and stepped away from the fire's dying embers. Clara rose, clutching the baby close, and followed with her eyes. Out of the low scrub, a figure appeared, barefoot, bareheaded, skin dark as walnut and hair tied in a single braid down the back. A young man, maybe 20 summers at most, with a bow in one hand and a quiver slung across his back. His eyes were fixed on Jonah. They stood like that for a long moment, two silhouettes in the dawn light. Finally, the young man spoke, his voice sharp and clipped in Apache. Clara couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the tension in them. Jonah answered in the same tongue, low and steady. The young man's gaze flicked to Clara, then to the baby in her arms. His jaw tightened, and he stepped forward. "That's close enough," Jonah said in English, his voice firm. The young man stopped, but his hand strayed toward an arrow. Clara's grip on Nayate tightened until he stirred and whimpered. The sound seemed to cut through the standoff like a knife. The young man's eyes softened not much, but enough for Jonah to lower his own hand from the knife hilt. "This is my cousin," Jonah said, turning slightly toward Clara. "Tyankoa. He's been following us since Copper Ridge." "Why?" Clara asked. Jonah's mouth tightened. "Because he was sent to bring the child back." The air seemed to thin. Clara took a step back, instinct pulling her away from both men. Back to who Tyan said something in Apache, quick and almost pleading. Jonah listened, his face unreadable, then turned to Clara. "To the elders," he said. "They believe Nayate must be raised among his people. They do not trust that I can do it alone." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Is that what you want?" Jonah looked at her, then not a glance, but the kind of look that weighed both the truth and the cost of saying it. "I want him safe, but I do not believe he will be. Not now. Too many still hold grudges against my bloodline." The young man stepped closer, slower this time, and addressed Clara directly in halting English. "The boy's mother, my aunt, she would want him with us. You are not of our blood." Clara felt heat rise in her chest, not from anger, but from something older, the sting of being told, "You do not belong." She looked down at Nayate, his small hand curled into her shirt. "I may not be of your blood," she said, her voice steady, "but I've fed him, carried him, and kept him alive since the day Jonah put him in my arms. That counts for something." Tayan's eyes flicked to Jonah, searching for an answer. Jonah spoke again in Apache, his tone harder now. The younger man's shoulders slumped slightly, but he did not back away. Finally, Jonah turned to Clara. "He will travel with us for now. He says the others are 2 days behind. That gives us some room. It was not the answer she wanted, but it was better than losing the child before she had a chance to fight for him. They broke camp quickly. Tayan walked ahead, moving like water through the brush, his bow ready. Jonah led the mare, and Clara rode with Nayati tucked close, his tiny breast warm against her collarbone. The day grew hotter, and the land rose into hills flecked with granite outcrops. Mid-afternoon, they reached a narrow pass where the wind funneled through like the breath of a hidden giant. Clara noticed Jonah's gaze sweeping the ridges above them, his body tightening with each step. They were halfway through when it happened. A shout rang out from the rocks, a voice in Apache, sharp and commanding, then another, and then the glint of steel. From both sides of the pass, figures emerged, men with bows drawn, their hair bound, their faces streaked with ochre. There were 6, maybe 7, and all of them had their eyes on the child. Jonah stepped in front of Clara, knife in one hand, the other reaching for the mare's bridle. Tayan froze, his bow halfway raised. One of the men called down, his voice low and deliberate. Jonah answered in kind, his words clipped, tense. Clara couldn't understand, but she could read the set of his shoulders. This was not going their way. The leader of the group descended from the rocks. He was older, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes like flint. Around his neck hung a small carved pendant almost identical to the one Nayati wore under his blanket. When he reached them, he looked first at Jonah, then at Clara, and finally at the baby. His gaze lingered there, unreadable. "You have carried him far," the man said in English. His voice was rough, but there was no malice in it. But his blood calls him home. Clara held Nayati tighter, and if his home is not safe, the man's eyes narrowed. No home is safe, but it is still home. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind whispered through the pass, carrying with it the faint scent of pine from some far-off grove. Then Jonah spoke, his voice quiet but sharp enough to cut. "If you take him now, he dies, not by your hand, but by the divisions among our people. You know this." The older man studied him, then glanced at Tayan, who gave a small nod. Something unspoken passed between them. Finally, the leader stepped back. 3 days, he said. 3 days to prove you can keep him alive. After that, we come for him. And just like that, the men melted back into the rocks, leaving only the echo of their footsteps behind. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Jonah met her eyes. "We move fast now. There will be no second warning." They rode until the stars were high. The road ahead a ribbon of pale dust. Clara felt the weight of those 3 days pressing on her not just as a measure of time, but as the edge of a choice she wasn't ready to make. Somewhere deep inside, she knew the circle was closing, and when it did, there would be no way back. They counted time by shadows after that. Morning shadows long as a man's worry, noon shadows small as a coin, and evening shadows that stretched toward them like roads they might never walk. Day 1 began with a thin wind and a line of geese flying north, their calls falling like distant bells. Jonah Koa set a steady pace through low hills flecked with pinyon. Clara May rode the bay mare with Nayati held high against the heat. Tayan Koa, silent as a question, ranged ahead and to the right, a slim figure stitched to the land. Before noon, the air climbed past 95 degrees. They crossed a shallow draw where the earth turned redder, as if the day itself were bruising. Nayati fussed, then cried, then slumped into a fretful sleep. Clara shifted him to her bare shoulder and felt the heat in his small body rise another degree against her skin. "He's running warm," she said. Jonah touched the baby forehead with the back of his fingers. His face turned serious. "We stop at water. They found a trickle under a bank of willows, more sound than stream." Clara wetted a cloth and sponged Nayati's temples, his wrists, the soft place at the base of his throat. Jonah filled the canteen twice. When Tayan slipped back into view, he glanced at the child, then at the sky, measuring weather with the quick math of someone raised to read it. "Storm east," he said. "Maybe lightning. Maybe flood." They moved again, hugging the higher side of the draw. The land opened to a flat where the wind smelled of tin and rain. At mid-afternoon, the clouds stacked black on black. Sheets of water marched across the basin 5 miles away. And then came the bright, single crack of lightning, close enough to taste. The first fat drops hit like thrown pebbles. Jonah pointed to a stand of cottonwoods on a slight rise. They made it there on the run. The storm arrived all at once, wind hunting through the branches, rain flattening the grass, a roar that folded the world into white noise. Clara wrapped the baby under her shawl and held him with both arms. The mare stood with her rump to the weather, stoic as a church door. When the rain slid off into the east, everything smelled new. But Nayati's heat had not broken. His breath came quick, small pulls that tugged at Clara's nerves. "I need to cool him slow," she said. No shock. She soaked another cloth and laid it across the baby chest, humming the tune her mother once used for fevers. Jonah watched, jaw tight, as if he might wrestle the fever with his own hands if he could. Tyne crouched near the wet char of a lightning strike and studied the ground. "Goat herder, 2 valleys over," he said, almost to himself. "Old man, Greasewood Camp. I saw smoke there yesterday." Jonah looked up. "You sure?" "Yes." Jonah weighed the sky. "How far? 5 miles. Maybe 6. Clara held the baby closer. "Go," she said. "Bring milk if hell part with it. It'll keep him cool." Tyne rose without another word and slid into the brush. He moved like a stitch through cloth and gone, leaving only the shape of his absence behind. They waited. Clara sponged and hummed, watching the little rise and fall of Nayati's ribs. Jonah paced a short line that wore the grass shiny. By the time the sun leaned west, the child's breath had eased to something less frantic, but the fever still sat in him like a coal. Dusk found them just as Tayan returned, thin smile breaking the hard line of his mouth. Over his shoulder hung a small skin bag, warm to the touch. "Goat milk," he said, breath short but proud. Old man took a silver button and a promise. "What promise?" Jonah asked. "That it'd bring the gourd back," Tayan said, with a shrug that made Clara like him more than she expected to. They warmed the milk by holding the skin bag near the coals and fed it to Nayati with a strip of cloth, drop by patient drop. The child's fussing softened to small sounds. His eyes, dark as wet stone, found Clara's face and held there. When he finally slept, the fever had loosened its grip by a finger's width. Night came clear, stars thrown high. Clara lay on her side with the baby in the crook of her arm and listened to Jonah's breathing unwind. Somewhere beyond the edge of hearing, she imagined the tribe turning its slow attention their way a weight, not yet a hand. Day 2 began with a sky washed clean. They moved northeast through sage flats where the air shimmered over the earth like glass. The heat came back, but not in anger. It pressed steady, as if reminding them what country they were crossing. Near noon, they found the ruins of an old mission wall, 2 courses of adobe left standing, a square of shade the size of a kitchen table. A few gnarled apples clung to a tree that had learned drought the hard way. Jonah knocked one loose for Clara, and the taste tart, sweet, Dusty pushed a memory up so fast it almost hurt. Her boy had gummed apple mash on a spoon once, a lifetime measured in weeks. She swallowed and handed the core to Jonah. He took it without looking at her, and that small mercy felt like a hand on the shoulder. Tyan ranged wider. When he returned late in the afternoon, his shoulders were set in the way of a man who'd made a choice and hoped it was right. "There's a place," he said. "Stone circle up ahead. Old. Our people use it when things must be decided by the wind." Clara felt Jonah go still beside her. "You led them to us," he said. "Not accusation. Fact." Tyan shook his head once. "I sent word, but I told them only this come without weapons in hand. Come with ears, or don't come at all." Jonah's eyes held him. "And if they come as hunters, then I stand with you," Tyan said, and the words came out like a cut. He looked away, toward the north. "Blood is not the only thread. You taught me that when I was 10 and broke another boy's bow to stop a fight. You made me mend it. You said a man must leave the circle better than he found it." Clara watched Jonah's face soften and harden at the same time, like water scummed with ice. He nodded once, small, as if acknowledging both betrayal and courage in the same breath. They camped a mile shy of the circle, where a low hill threw a sliver of shade. Nayati took the goat milk, then Clara's breast, then slept with his mouth open, a tiny snore like a cricket. His fever no longer burned. It smoldered in the blue hour. Clara and Jonah sat without fire, backs leaning on the same rock, not touching. The land held its breath. A nighthawk wove low, scissoring the air. When Jonah finally spoke, his voice came from that quiet place he used when things mattered. "If I ask you to run tomorrow," he said, "will you do it?" "I'll run if you run," Clara said. "But if you stand, I'll stand." He was silent a long beat. "Then we stand smart. Words before blood." She nodded, and the nod felt like a ring passed between them. Day 3 brought a dawn clear enough to show truth. The stone circle lay on a low rise, 20 paces across. Each rock set into the earth so long ago it seemed the land had grown around them. Carving scarred some stone storms, birds, a sun with long teeth. The wind moved through the circle with a tone Clara felt more than heard, a low note that stitched her to the ground. They stepped inside. Jonah at Clara's left, Tyan at her right, Nayati in her arms. No one spoke. It felt wrong to talk until the circle allowed it. They did not wait long. Figures crested the ridge to the west and came down in a measured line. Men first, then 2 women, one older, hair gone to silver, her step sure as a shepherd's. At their center walked Nakai Ironcloud, lean as weathered wood, his eyes taking everything in without seeming to move. They stopped at the circle's edge. Ironcloud's gaze passed over Jonah, paused on Tyan, then settled on Claire and the child. When he spoke, his English was careful, shaped by a mouth that preferred other sounds. "You were given 3 days," he said. "You used them. I used them to keep him breathing," Clara said, because the circle felt like a place where a person should not waste language on decoration. Ironcloud's face did not change. A child belongs to his people. A child belongs where he is loved, Clara said. Quiet. Even if those are the same place, good. If they are not, then a choice has to be made. Jonah's voice came low. "If you take him now, you tear the band in 2. Old anger will wake. You know this." Wind moved the edge of Ironcloud's hair. For a long breath, no one spoke. Then the older woman stepped forward. Lines mapped her face in careful work, the kind time does when it respects a life. She looked at Clara, not at the child first, and something like recognition lifted her mouth at one corner. "When I was 7, she said, "my mother's milk dried in a winter that would not end. I was fed by a woman from the mission who spoke no word of our tongue. My uncle said my spirit would be lost. My body did not care. My body wanted to live." Clara felt the circle lean in. The woman turned to Ironcloud. "You know this story," she said, "because the uncle who wanted me buried was your father." Silence arrived like a new weather. Even the wind seemed to listen harder. "We will not be smaller than the love that kept me," the woman said. "Not today." Ironcloud closed his eyes for one beat. When he opened them, a long history looked out: pride, injury, memory, the cost of being a man. People obey. He stepped forward to the stone at the circle's lip and laid his hand on it, palm down, as if testing its temperature. Clara held her breath. The world balanced. "Speak, Nakay," the older woman said, and her voice carried the weight of someone who had waited many winters to ask this. Ironcloud's mouth opened, and the wind took his first word away. The wind carried that first word into the sage. It sounded almost like yes. Or maybe that was the circle speaking for him. Nakai Ironcloud lowered his hand from the stone and looked at Jonah, then at Taeon. Finally, at Clara May, who stood with the baby as if she had always been meant to. "You took him from the fire," Ironcloud said. "Now you want to keep him from the smoke." Clara's voice stayed even. "I want to keep him breathing. That's all." A long silence followed. Behind the group, clouds drifted over the distant buttes like slow cattle, each casting a shadow that lengthened and thinned. The older woman stepped closer to Clara. Her eyes were dark, but not hard. "His name Nayati," Clara said. "It means stands firm." The woman nodded once. "It will mean the same, wherever he stands." She turned to Ironcloud and spoke in Apache, the words low and sure. No one translated, but Clara could feel their shaped like stones laid one on another, building something. When the woman finished, Ironcloud's face softened, not much, but enough for the men beside him to shift their weight. He looked at Jonah again. "You know the terms." Jonah's jaw worked once. "I know." Ironcloud's gaze went back to Clara. "He may stay with you until he is old enough to walk into the circle on his own. Then he will choose, but the band will not forget him." Clara felt the breath leave her chest in a slow ribbon. "I can live with that," she said. "And you," Ironcloud said to Jonah, "will not bring war to our door with your anger." Jonah's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I will not bring war," he said, "but I will bring stories." Ironcloud seemed to accept that as something between a promise and a threat. He turned, signaling the others to follow. The older woman lingered just a moment longer, placing her hand-warm, work-worn over Clara's on the baby's back. Then she stepped away, and the line of figures moved toward the west until they were part of the horizon. They left the circle with no more words than they brought in. The sky had tilted toward afternoon, and the air smelled faintly of rain over Redwater Creek. Jonah led the way. Taeon walked last, scanning their back trail without seeming to. Clara held Nayati close, feeling his slow, even breath against her collarbone. By sundown they reached the creek, swollen from storms, the red silt turning the water the color of rusted iron. Clara knelt and let the cold run over her hands, then touched it to the baby's cheeks. He stirred, but didn't wake. "Well, camp here tonight," Jonah said. "The ground's soft, but it's good cover." They built a small fire from driftwood, the flames low, the light just enough to warm without announcing them to the whole valley. Over a pot, Jonah boiled strips of rabbit and mesquite beans, making a broth rich enough for strength. Clara fed the baby first, then herself. When the stars came out, the creek's surface caught them in broken pieces, carrying them downstream. Clara sat back against a log, Nayati asleep in her lap. Jonah sat cross-legged across from her, the fire's edge lighting his cheekbones in bronze and shadow. "You could have fought him," Clara said quietly. "I could have," Jonah answered. "But the boy would remember that fight more than any victory. He needs to remember we chose something else." Clara looked down at the child's face, peaceful now in a way that felt almost sacred. "You think hell choose us when the time comes?" Jonah's eyes lifted to hers, steady. "I think hell choose what lets him stand firm. That's all any man can do." A night bird called from the far bank. The creek murmured on, unbothered by human bargains. The next morning they broke camp early, following the creek downstream until it bent toward open country. Tyan rode ahead for a while, then dropped back to ride beside Clara. His expression was hard to read, part relief, part something heavier. "You kept your word," she said. He gave a small shrug. "The old woman, she is my aunt. She saw herself in you. That's why this worked. Then I owe her more than I can say." Tayan's eyes flicked to the sleeping child. "One day, you'll owe him more than that." They rode on, the silence between them not uncomfortable. By mid-afternoon, Copper Ridge's low roofs came into sight, heat shimmering above them. Clara felt her chest tighten not with fear, but with the strange mix of weight and lightness that comes when you've carried something too far to set down carelessly. When they reached her cabin, Jonah dismounted first, then lifted Nayati gently into her arms. "You have milk. You have shelter," he said. "I'll come when I can." She nodded, her throat thick, "and I'll keep him safe." Tyan touched the brim of his hat to her, then turned his horse after Jonah's. The two men rode toward the horizon, one tall and steady, the other lean and restless. Clara watched until they were no more than two moving shadows in the heat. Then she stepped inside, closed the door, and held Nayati against her heart. His small hand opened and closed in his sleep, as if he were testing the shape of the world. "Stands firm," she whispered, and knew she would teach him how. Years later, she would tell the story to him as the wind scratched the roof in winter or sang in the cottonwoods in summer. She would tell it not as a warning, nor as a burden, but as proof that sometimes a person's life turns because someone else stood still and listened. And he would smile, not always knowing which parts were his memory and which were hers. Some choices in life are not made with the head, but with the heart, and those are the ones that shape us most. In a land where fear, prejudice, and old wounds ran deep, one woman saw beyond the boundaries drawn by history. She did not see an Apache warrior as an enemy, nor the child in his arms as a burden, but as a life worth saving. For those of us who have lived many seasons, we know that life's deepest joys often come from unexpected places, from the moments when we risk comfort to offer kindness. Compassion can cross divides that words cannot. Forgiveness can open doors that anger has kept closed for years. This story reminds us that healing is not always loud. Sometimes it comes in the quiet acts of care, in holding on when it's easier to let go. It asks us to remember that we are never too old to make a difference, to extend grace, or to be changed by love. In the end, the courage to do what right even when the world says otherwise may be the legacy we leave behind. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, please give it a like. Share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next journey. Your support helps us keep bringing these tales of love, courage, and hope to life.